Yeah, we're delighted to have this conversation. Richard is many things. You can see he's got a, for those of you who are more observant, a pin
He's
badge
probably
there.
going to mention these.
Yeah. Um, and you're currently working for the Accutron brand
Yeah.
uh, as what are you sales director there at the moment?
Yeah, that would be the title. It's kind of it's a small brand, it's a boutique brand, so there's a lot going on and kind of got my hands in everything from, design and I mean just you name it, a little bit of everything. It's really an a big input brand where, that Michael Benavente is the head of Bulova, obviously runs everything myself, and then the design team. And it's really, to be honest, I spend a lot of time in the field with collectors like yourselves, and honestly, it's really a collector driven brand. So you, regardless of whose title is what, it really, a lot of it is born from meetings like this. Like I speak to all of you, you give me feedback, I take that to the 29th floor of the Empire State Building, and the design team goes crazy, and we have a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, that's very exciting. We can maybe come back to talk about that a bit later. But
Sure.
what I wanted to start with was we spoke a few months ago, and you told me the story of how you got into pullover, and you weren't a watch guy, as far as I understood it,
No,
until
it wasn't.
one particular period of time. So I hoped you could start with that, and then move on to telling us, about how what seems to me to be love at first sight turned into a rather amazing collection and collecting period of your life.
Yeah, so it was Christmas Eve, and I needed to get a watch for work. I wasn't allowed to have one of these demons in my hand while I was there, and they wanted me very engaged. I had owned a bunch of restaurants and was doing work and wanted to be engaged with the team. So I wanted to put the phone away and have a keep time on a wristwatch. And I love the American brand of Bulova, and there was actually the one and only Bulova branded store in America was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is like Amish country. It's not a place you would expect to have that, and I was very lucky that it was there. I showed up when they closed at 8 on Christmas Eve, and that's when I got there. Knocked on the door. The young man who was selling kind of said, "Hey, I'll stay open a little later." I promised him I would buy two timepieces if he let me in. And as a good salesman would, he opened the doors and he picked them. And I bought them. I said, this is what I'm looking for. They had these beautiful to know shapes, which to me just screamed like this classic, beautiful, almost 20s, 30s kind of vibe.
Hmm.
And I just, again, it was love at first sight, exactly as Hamish said. And I just fell in love with it. And I ended up within just a few months buying almost 26 timepieces from it. um, yeah, and that's that with Accutron, they were it was Bulova, Accutron by Bulova at the time. They were expensive. They were the higher end Swiss timepieces, but they were amazing. And then it started. It really, the love affair and the collecting, and the reason I got kind of fell head over heels was the it looked the way I wanted it to look, but that salesperson again said, go research Joseph Bullock. I think you're going to find him really interesting as an entrepreneur. And once I read about who he was, who his son was, John, Baird, and all these different people that were part of the company early on, and who Joseph was, uh, it was something that blew me away. And as a consultant and doing like executive training and being able to work with companies, his example of leadership was something I used a lot. And it's something that really shaped my leadership. So, it became almost like a lifestyle and a sickness, as you all have. And it turned into thousands of timepieces, um, and a museum and this job, which is amazing. So yeah, so it really was meant to be, and it was a beautiful thing. So here I am
So could
talking to you.
can you tell us a bit more about that? Because obviously most watch people they do fall into the watch world, and we all call it falling down the rabbit hole, and we have a passion. And most people acquire a few timepieces, but they don't move into that stage of buying the numbers that you were acquiring.
Yeah,
And it's you were I mean, very passionate about really getting a lot.
all of it.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so can you just explain a bit more about that drive and that feeling, especially with such a big brand? We're not talking about a brand that made
150 years of watchmaking. We
10
got a lot of
models,
pieces of
10
mind.
models a year. We're talking about one of the biggest brands ever. So can you talk about why you decided on that route style of collecting and kind of what were the
Yeah.
practicalities of acquiring that many timepieces?
So I would say, and for the sake of time, because we were saying we could talk forever, right? For the sake of time, I would just say this is that when I really found out who they were, and then I started diving into how they designed, how they created their business. And we did the same thing with modern Accutron. We used the same business philosophies and design philosophies on how to create new product, and they continued to do it in a way that really was, where is the world at? And when you're in the 20s and the 30s, you're very Art Deco, especially in the 20s. And they were making watches. The suffragette movement was around all over Europe as well as in America. And he employed more women than anyone else in the world. He was really driving, the watchmaking business with women as well, realizing that they have this dexterity and thing that we didn't have as men, and was using them. And he also used that to sell watches. He
Hmm.
created the first full line of women's watches, named them after, I mean, he gave them names, women's names. So what are they going to do? They're going to buy their watch, right? That's brilliant, So there was a lot going on there. And that happened, you roll into the 30s and they had really three commercial, but four fully automatic timepieces by 1932 that were four different patents and designs.
Hmm.
Not a bumper like everyone else was using, but they had three other watches that were automatics. That was amazing. So they started to fall into that technological piece, because that's where the world of watchmaking was going. Then in the 40s and 50s, it was about Hollywood and the Academy Award watches. And the 50s, this is a crazy thing. In America, you would never have guessed this. I didn't. In America, the number one family pastime was boating. What? Like, I mean, there's a few states that are around the oceans, but most of it's landlocked, right? And the boating was the big thing. So they came out with all these watches that they re-released just a few years ago and are continuing to re-release now. And they're these classic, beautiful timepieces. You get into the 60s, and we got to go to the moon. So who did they ask? The government asked Bulova. Bulova created Accutron, and Accutron times the missions, all 46 missions to the moon.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, it's amazing. If you look, people say, oh, the lost decades were the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That is absolutely false. What was amazing about the 70s is it was this great transition of the quartz crisis and what we became, and how Accutron kind of folded over and Bulova folded over into this new brand that did a lot of different things. And Accutron became kind of like the true American brand, I say, because it was making watches in Japan way back then. It was making them in Switzerland, and it was making them in America. So it was using the best of what the world had to offer, which
Hmm.
is kind of what America's theme is, right? We try to do that. And we just take the best from everywhere and say, how do we get you on board, and how do we make great things happen? And you ask the people and let them forge the path. And they've never stopped doing that. In the 80s, the watches were essentially like Piaget-esque, right? Um, and it was like those watches like really were like, kind of defining when it came to design. And they were gold nugget watches. They had like these beautiful, like solid gold, the patterns in the bracelet, excuse me, the patterns in the bracelet followed straight through the
Hmm.
actual dials. And it was really jewelry at that point. And then in the 90s, there was turmoil as far as who was going to own us and what the direction was going to be. And then the brand, kind of slowed down on being out there and becoming that door where, you know, they were trying to sell as many watches as possible because that was the 80s, right? It was just capitalism was king. And they wanted to get back to doing things that were more real. And they kind of sized things down and started getting really particular about the design and quality again, and brought that level back up because they saw that may have slipped a little bit. And then in the 2000s, I mean, Accutron went crazy as a Swiss brand, and they made just amazing timepieces. I mean, 52 jewel Kosk timepieces. So I fell in love with all of that, and I wasn't sure where the brand was going to go because it was for sale again, and it was going to go. There was some people that were in the brand that were going to buy it. There was obviously Citizen, and I just wanted to preserve that history. I mean, it has generationally it's a generational watch in America. Everybody you meet has someone in their family, if not themselves, that owns a Bulova.
Yeah.
And today, it's the number one, number two sell through watch in the country. It's back to being a collector's item where people own 6 or 7.
Mm-hmm. And that passion for the design, like when there's so many watches, because you know, I think for the benefit of people, for the benefit of the people who don't know the brand, you know, their ranges every year were huge in almost all of those decades you're talking about. There's a very, very large number every year of styles that they had, like some brands today, but many brands today have a much narrower range. So how did you go about knowing that you were getting the real deal and knowing that this was, and even knowing what year it was, you know, because there's no, you know, there was no internet recording all this stuff, and I'm sure the company's lost many an archive over the years, and maybe all of them. So can you talk a bit about how you created your own catalog, as it were, as you were building the collection?
Well, what's really interesting is that at the same exact time, and there's some amazing collectors in England that work with a company in an online resource called mybulova.com.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was doing and didn't realize they were doing and other people were doing was, as I was buying, I was cataloging and trying to find out what this stuff meant. Because what I did find out very quickly was that when they moved from Queens, and now Bulova's built 18 buildings in New York, and 2 of them are, you know, I mean, like really, they're landmarks, and they're special buildings. When they were diminishing that, and they had 2 trucks pull away, the story goes, with all of the information, and they were never to be found again, and the history was lost. So what I love about what we all do is all of these, I call us horological archaeologists. I don't like the idea of necessary collectors or enthusiasts. The real archaeologists of the brands, and those people know who they are. They really kind of geek out and nerd out on trying to find all these pieces of the puzzle again. And I started buying everything. I was buying, you know, I was buying magazines. I was buying anything that had an ad in it, anything, so I could redefine what it was. And what I found was, wow, this watch was highly collectible. They were everywhere. They were producing them in huge amounts. And you can get them for relatively cheap. But to find an original, a museum quality, as we would call it, all original timepiece, very rare. I mean, they're very hard to find. A lot of bracelets have been traded out. A lot of crystals have been traded out. A lot of hands have been traded out. Dials, cases, and movements are pretty common to be together. But to figure it all out, you know, I was like, it was kind of backbreaking work, and it was definitely a hobby, but it was a big commitment. And then I found the My Bulova website, and they had archives, and people were sending in all their info, and they had people working on it to archive everything. And I was like, wow, I wish I found that shortcut sooner.
Yeah.
But I was, at the time, my goal was just buy everything. And took my first one to get fixed and couldn't believe how much money it was, and said, I got to learn how to clean these things. So that started really me opening cases and digging in and realizing that every part has an ebosh on it and what those mean, and then buying books that tell you who the eboshes are, and shadow books so you can put the part over the shadow and make sure it was the exact part, and not a part that has been, like built or remade. So it really went from there. It kind of, like you said, it's a rabbit hole.
So my final question for now, and then we'll see who else wants to ask one. But can you talk a little bit about the rather remarkable step, which is that your collection became what's now known as is known and seen as a museum by the company. So
Yeah.
how did that come about? Where is it? What does it actually comprise? Can we go and see it? Just talk about the journey from it being something you built with obviously great care and dedication to something now available for the public or the customers of Bullover.
Yeah. So the part of the new switch over with the purchase of the brand was that, and this was where I think it got lucky. I wasn't sure where it was going to go. I was trying to buy everything so I can make my own museum. I met some people from the past and thought that, I might do a better job myself with it, telling the story from a collector's perspective. But Citizen took over. They brought people in like Michael Benavente, and they were just passionate about the history and wanted to meet people. So I got myself and a few other collectors from all over the world to come to New York. We had conversations, and Michael calls everybody today is what is he? His kitchen cupboard, I think he calls us. And he'll call every one of these collectors randomly and just have conversations. So we still, I mean, even with me being inside, I still don't hear everything going on anymore. So, we'll email back and forth. I spoke to Michael today, what are you guys working on? What's happening? And it's really exciting to have a brand that wants to be driven by us, So the company came to me, said, we heard you have this insane collection. We'd like to see it. I invited them out to one of my businesses. They came out. I set up probably about 12 feet worth of product, maybe a couple hundred pieces. And they were blown away and said, can we buy this and just make it a museum? And I was like, well, probably not, but let's talk about what we can do. And it took some convincing of me to kind of give up the babies. But once I realized who they were and where their hearts were, it was really easy for me. They were very willing in the contract to say that there'll be archival people running this, overseeing it. I mean, I have sales books, pitch books from the 1920s, and no one else has these books in the world, right? Like there's a few out there, but I have some that I don't even share with the world. Like I have a lot of things that I haven't even shown. There's something I'm restoring right now that is a very significant timepiece that nobody is aware of. And Bulova, it's that way because Bulova lost all of its history. So we're rebuilding it.
Amazing. So where is the collection, that collection now?
So the collection is actually right now, the museum itself, the archive is in a few buildings in New York, but mostly housed in the Empire State Building. So the Empire State Building is the main office building of Bulova. They own the whole 29th floor. So that entire floor of the Empire State Building belongs to that branding company. So there's all brands there, but that was always Bulova's spot. So everybody else moved in, and we have these really unique office spaces. And the archive itself actually functions as a space that we entertain clients in, and we do other stuff. The building itself, because of COVID, it used to be something that was a lot easier to access. But after COVID, it's been on a bit of a lockdown. But we did open up our flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York. And once we get a year under our belt, we are going to look at, doing archival and interesting events there for everyone to come to. I mean, that's really a big part of what we want that space to be, is to share our archives and museums. Because again, 150 years in New York City. I mean, not a lot of companies can say that they've continuously run that long there.
No, and it's interesting because it'll be very interesting for me to see how you get on with that, because I think you'll find that what an enthusiast, especially one such as yourself, would put on for the evening is very different to what your marketing team's idea of what they should put on. So you may have one of the reasons the Watch Collectors Club exists is to help bridge the gaps between what the main marketing themes of today are and versus the context of history, where the watch enthusiasts find that fascinating, but maybe it's not quite the focus on the brand message. So you'll enjoy having those discussions and designing those events, I'm sure.
Oh, they're the best. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
So at this stage, I'd welcome any questions from anyone. You can either put your hand up or just unmute if you're willing, and go ahead.
Yeah, Benjamin's had his hand up for a while, so love to answer that question.
Yeah, go ahead. Or, of course, you can put it in the chat and I can read it out.
Okay. Hi, Richard. I'm Steve, and I'm the club resident Boulevard eccentric.
I love it.
So I have quite a large collection. Like you, I've been collecting for about 15 years.
That's great.
But I just tend to buy everything. But I also work within a budget. So so far I've avoided some of the more expensive models, but I have quite a wide collection. I sort of think a lot about the philosophy of collecting. You know, do I just carry on buying everything, or should I slow down? I have recently started buying some of the more, you know, less of them, but more of the expensive models, like a Spinnaker and a chronograph from the 1970s. But I'd just be interested in your idea on the sort of philosophy of collecting, really.
Well, you know, it's funny. I think, you know, I come from very humble beginnings, so I'm very conscious of what I've learned in life is that people love a lot of different things, and their passion comes from a lot of different places. And I don't think I could ever tell any of you, you know, how to collect differently or better. But what I would suggest, if I may, having, you know, been kind of to where I'm at, where I am today, I mean, we're over 5,000 pieces at its largest, and I'm under 1,000 now. I've started building watches and making watches from scratch. So it's very expensive to buy things like rose engines and things like that. So we've traded those things out. So for me, you know, it got very expensive when you get into the 60s and 70s with, like you said, the chronographs. When you're trying to find the very early pieces like push button, single push buttons, and even the push pin automatic from the 1930s, some of those pieces, like they even had a pendulum clock that was a wristwatch that had a pendulum in it. These pieces, when you find them, they're $15,000, like they're expensive. So I think that you've got to kind of just follow your heart, because you said something that almost made me giggle a little, and it probably made everybody giggle a little, is, should I just, stop trying to buy everything? Steve, you're the guy who's just going to buy everything anyway, right? Like, I'm that way as well. I had to realize that no matter what, I'm never going to stop buying everything, whether it's everything of this or everything of that. It's kind of my nature, right? So I think that if you really still love finding everything, and your passion is in that archaeological piece where I want to have, I was just asked the question in the offices on what's the difference between a collector and an enthusiast. And that was a really interesting question. And I think we would all probably answer it a little different. But my answer was, collectors go deep and enthusiasts go wide. So what I mean is, an enthusiast may have a lot of different brands, right? But a collector who's also an enthusiast is going to go deep. You went deep. You're a bull of a collector. You're a watch enthusiast, but you're a bull of a collector. Does that make sense? Like, that's how I see it. So I think if you're kind of asking, should I stop being a bull of a collector? I don't know if that's possible. Like, why would we ever do that? It's the greatest brand in the world, in my opinion. I'll never stop buying, like, no matter what. My wife, not a big fan of that, but it is what it is. I hope that answers.
Yeah. I'm on the same wavelength, really. At the beginning, I was collecting all sorts of brands, and then I realized I liked American watches, so I focused on American watches. Then I narrowed it down to Elgin and Boulevard.
Awesome.
And then after a while, I realized that Bulova was the one that really produced the most outstanding designs, as far as I was concerned.
I would
So
agree.
the last 12 years or so, I've just really bought nothing other than Bulovas.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, no, that's great. And listen, it's a brand that keeps on giving because the history is so rich, and the more you dig, the more you find,
Yeah.
which is why you get lost. You know, like there was a point in my collecting where I really had to pull the reins back because like I was setting because back in the beginning, you know, there wasn't the internet like it is today. So I would have auction houses and I would give them a certain number of dollars to spend. And I would say, these are all the watches I want, just buy them and send them to me. And I was getting like 3 to 6 boxes a day of watches because their job is to make money. So they're just spending my money like crazy. And I had to kind of pull the reins back on that because it got a little out of control. And I had to be a little smarter. So, you know, I had about 1,300 pieces when I initially sold part of the collection to the museum, donated a good portion then and since. But I ended up realizing I can buy more. I'm smarter now, and grew that to thousands of watches, you know, and parts and pieces and bracelets. I started collecting just the bracelets and had every bracelet, and then crystals. I've got bags of crystals, you know, like it's a problem.
So I think John put his hand up, and then after John, Waldo.
Yeah, cheers. And thanks for the talk as well. One question I had, I'll probably ask Steve this next to meet up as well. You'd mentioned wanting to rein it back a bit at one point.
Right.
So my question was around, as things got into the 4 digits in terms of the number of pieces, how did you plan out the storage? And did that factor in pulling things back a little?
Yep. So storage is unique, right? So you get to a point where it takes up like your whole home. So I did get boxes like in the back. I still have a few right now that I don't even know what's in them because to be honest, I lost the keys. So I'm trying to find out what's in them now. But I'm too cheap to like pay to have the keys redone. But but there's still boxes in banks, right? And I categorize mine. So whether I stored them in my home or off premise, when it got larger, everything was built on decades for me. So I switched it around a lot. Like I said, okay, I'm going to do just chronographs and then just, you know, accutrons and just this and just and I said, do you know what? I know well enough what I'm talking about and what I'm seeing that if I go to the 1930s, I'm going to find the watch I want to find. And then I separated them on serviced and unserviced. So then I started servicing them. So now I have this massive collection of service pieces as opposed to ones that don't work, but they're good representations of the brand from a, you know, museum quality standpoint. And then there was honestly the parts and pieces. So you would buy a watch that had the wrong bracelet, or you would buy a watch that didn't have a crystal, or you would buy a watch because it had the right hands, but it was beaten up, but the hands were in great condition and I would need them for, you know, popular 10 a.m. movements from the 20s or whatever, you know. So I would have kind of the parts and piece boxes, and then I would go through that. And then I got into parts and pieces. So I just bought crystals. So now there's a crystal case, and now there's a, you know, hands case. And then I realized that they sold all of those trays of Bulovas to the stores. So there were these metal boxes with trays and it had all their parts, and they would sell them to the watchmakers. So I just started finding those and buying those. So now I have stacks of those with all the parts in it. So yeah.
Go ahead, Waldo.
Thanks, Hamish, and thank you for the talk. Echo what everyone said. It is really interesting and lovely to hear the enthusiasm which you bring to it. It's inspiring. I love American watches as well. My sort of question for your observation is a bit more. I've had a bit of a problem in the past, I think, with Citizen as a brand because of the amount of watches they make, and then the lack of ability to upkeep the maintenance of those watches over a period as short as 12 years even. Right. They don't have the spare parts for them anymore. They don't, so that's a bit about why they just make so many watches, they can't keep parts for everything. So it sort of says something about what you're expecting quality from in terms of your customer basis.
Yeah.
And Bolivar being and watches at the companies at the moment having their heritages and their histories bought as more of a sort of selling thing, so that they can cash in on the heritage of those brands. You know, I love Hamilton watches. I'm a big fan of Hamilton from previous, but how that connection to the Hamilton today is I like the Hamiltons today as well, collect them both, but it's a tenuous connection. Even it's connected only in name in some way. Do you think there's a thing for Bolivar, or a fear that Bolivar is subsumed by that element of the market? And then it cheapens its product, and it makes a watch that can't be, serviced or repaired after sort of 12 years. I'm like you. I love watch. I've learned learning to service them and take them to pieces and to maintain my own bits and pieces. But that's that enthusiasm that you talk about. But you know, that as a brand, what do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think the statement is absolutely 100% true. I think that does happen, and it's risky because it can harm the brand, right? Especially from a collector's perspective, because then you get a little standoffish on it, and you're not exactly sure what you can, rely on. And that's from a parts perspective. You asked a lot of questions in there, so I'm going to try to break them down a little bit and then answer them all. So the second one would be that, what about collecting heritage? Like, these larger brands, whether it's, who I'll just say us because it's us. I'll always speak about us. Is that you take Citizen, and Citizen bought Bolivar because it's a heritage brand. That's exactly what you're saying, right? The other thing you said is, and that's on purpose, right? They want to capitalize on that in every sense of that word, right? But I also think you said something that links all of those things together, and you said, is anyone thinking of that? So that was my concern in the beginning too. Why was I going to make my own museum? I didn't trust anyone, right? And listen, I had a 30-year career. I did very well for myself, and I left it all and burned the boats at the shore to come and do this. I don't need to do this. I could be sitting in a beach house, sipping Bloody Marys in the morning and cocktails at night. And I'm traveling all over the world selling watches, right? For Accutron, right? But the reason is because of Citizen's philosophy with us, and because of the people they've chosen. So one of the things I used to always talk about when I talked from a business perspective to, let's say I was doing some, consulting or some development. People always said, like, how do I know this person's committed? And I said, well, there's three things. One, you can never ask somebody, right? Where do they put their time, money, and energy? That's how you know. So, Waldo, what I would say is, when you're asking that question, look at where companies put their time, money, and energy. So I can't speak for Citizen because I don't know the inner workings because of partly the answer to this question. They allow us, especially Accutron and Bolivar, to be a U.S. brand. But if we want a movement, we talk about what that movement is, what its jewel count needs to be, what its power reserve, and then we have engineers in Japan work on that. But they are creating from design to mechanical product everything in the U.S. and it's totally driven. So there isn't really a whole lot of things in the way of that. And I know that you mentioned other brands where you don't see that, and I think that's where we are doing things different, Bolivar, and we're having a much bigger response to it because of that, because it feels authentic, because it is authentic. When they looked at Accutron and they said, how do we relaunch a brand? Like, how in the world do you go to people and say, I want you to re-release the most iconic brand that has ever come out of America with the most iconic timepiece, the Space View tuning fork? Like, the design team had to be like, oh my God, I hate my life. Like, how do you, and I needed to be significant. I needed to matter. I needed to pay homage to what it was, but be something new today. That's a hard thing to do without being incredibly respectful and having reverence for what was done and who is really involved in it today. No exaggeration, Hamish, one of the reasons we're talking is because you met Joy. And Joy was out in Edinburgh, and she was at an Accutron event for us. And
yep.
she met
very
you.
Impressive. Very impressive woman.
Yeah. And she understood your enthusiasm. She called me up from there and was like, I met like the Richard version over here, and you two have to connect. And I think it still shocks the salespeople and teams when they meet people like us, because we're very eccentric. We kind of feel the way we feel, and we're very passionate. And we're a bit overwhelming at times. And I think the best part about it is we're not full of it. Like, we really know what we know, and we can back it up. Right? Like, some people are like, oh, I did this. Well, then let me see it. Let's talk more about it. And when you start to talk, you really know that they don't know. That doesn't happen with people like us. Like, when we say it, I can prove it. Right? Like, I can show you a bag this big of crystals, like 4 of them, like it's, my stuff's in a museum. I'm not just saying I like watches. I mean, I really like watches. Do you know what I mean? It's, I think we back up what we're saying, and that's intimidating to people. But I think that New York, the 29th floor, is full of people like us. And it wasn't that way when I first met them, but they've been recruiting in and building, and they've allowed the US team to build a US based team of enthusiasts and people who are just nerds about watches and love and can geek out and really talk and dive deep. One of the things I heard to prove all of that, I was taught, we meet with like Houdinki, and we meet with, Urban Gentry and, Analog Shift and, all of these people that kind of speak to and blog about things in the US. And every time they come to the office and talk to us, they say all the time, it always shocks us how much you are all enthusiasts like we are. Like, usually you go to offices and it's like there's a sales team and a marketing team, like, what's the plan and what's the point? Like, that's not, we all got our wrists in and we're all showing you. We don't start a meeting for like 40 minutes because we're all just so happy to be together talking watches. So maybe we don't get as much done as we used to, but I think the work we get done goes deep and it's authentic. And Waldo, I mean, let me ask you, based on those answers, am I making sense, or do you feel that in the Boulevard and
of course you
brand,
do. Absolutely. And I used to make films as a part of my so I'm part of my passion are the stories that are attached to things, and I think the great advantage that we have with those sort of collaborations is the ongoing story that's built from it too. It's connecting and keeping that story alive, which I really love, and so that's why I love in American watches, Elgin, Hamilton, and Bolivar, and collect some of them as well. For that heritage past, and thank the lucky stars that there is a place where that's trying to continue in a lineage. I think so. I definitely think my anxiety was peaked a little bit recently because of Citizen and a watch I had. This is partly what drove that question, but it's really nice to hear how independently they're allowing you to grow and build as that product. And I think, like you say, it depends on so much the people that you bring in to build it and keep that product and its heritage line alive.
I have something else for you. Here's good news and bad news. I'll share the bad news first because everybody wants the bad news first. So Boulevard's adopted a similar theory of how many parts and pieces can we actually keep on hand, right? And when you think about, and I can't speak for a Citizen, like I said, because I really don't know what they think and what they do, but from our perspective, warehousing, it's almost impossible to warehouse all that. It's like millions of pieces, right? So they decided to cut it off at 12 years, right? Because that's kind of a Citizen thing. But here's what's unique. we also have gone after local US watchmakers, and we donate parts to them. So we don't just let them go away. We actually are giving them to watchmakers in the US, and then we're driving people to those watchmakers. So we want to continue to build and support watchmaking, US watchmaking.
That's a really nice point to hear, because one of the things in their communications with me from Citizen was a sort of pointer to independent watchmakers where they would be able to maybe help more. So I found that quite a positive thing, especially in the UK at the moment, where parts and obtaining parts for watches is something that's a bit current in legislation even at the moment.
Oh, wow.
And the import of parts and who gets them and how they come from the brands and everything is a bit of a dispute going on between the wholesalers in this country and the Swiss government. But that's fine. I mean, but I think what you said is really incredible as well, to think that quantity of designs and that quantity of watches available. How do you keep those parts for longer than 12 years without having massive amounts of real estate or something to do it? So there is something.
Keep in mind, it has to be kept in a way that it doesn't degrade, right? Like you can't have rust build. I mean, I was just working on a watch for someone. It was a very special timepiece, but it was destroyed in water, and I had to rebuild the entire watch. And I didn't want to use, scavenge parts. It was her father's watch. It was important for a lot of personal reasons. But he passed away with this watch on, and I wanted to keep it all original. And, it's amazing how even just taking the weight off of a bridge for a wheel changes the timing. Like you can't, if you get too aggressive with the sanding, now the screw fits different. I had to it was terrible. I had to tap and die, create a whole new, it was crazy. I mean, it was actually crazy. So it was, it's amazing though what happens with the parts, even if they just get rusty. Like, how do you clean those up, and how does it, now it's not really going to do for the watch what it's supposed to do. So it's different. It's a tough problem to solve. So I think they had to draw a line somewhere, but I think the solution isn't in the problem, right? The solution was somewhere else. And what I love about this company is that it employs very smart people, and they let them tell us what to do. And those people said, why don't we make it more about support and send them to these watchmakers?
I think that ties the customer so well to the product too, because that creates relationships with the watch place where you get it serviced. That creates a relationship with the brand, because it's something that becomes generational. You can pass down. I saw a fantastic thing. An enthusiast, a Timex collector. And Timex watches are they're almost impossible to service because they're all riveted. but just the amazing collection of the most wonderful watches that were, because of the story that's told from that history, that I think is seductive. And Bulliver has such it's such an iconic brand with such an extraordinary story. I think it sits fair and square in the sort of journey of the history of horology in some sense. So it's lovely that it's still alive.
I'm glad everybody, and I've always known that, kind of England had always had a great collector group. There was a lot of people I've met over the years. But I have to say, I had a conversation with the team out there, and they're excited to talk with Hamish and you guys and start the conversation, because I think what we're doing here and what you're talking about, Waldo, and obviously everybody's enthusiasm, it's playing out in a real way over there now, and it's really starting to bubble up, and they want to do more of what we're doing here there. So this really can start that, and that's exciting. I mean, that's how we put our fingerprints on the brand and live through history, and that's special. There's a painting of Joseph Bulliver in the museum, and it's the original painting. It's a painting everyone has seen. but the original is in the office. And it's going to sound ridiculous, but I get emotional when I'm around that painting. And there's been many nights where everybody's gone and I'm in the offices and I go in the room, and whether I'm standing there or I'm sitting there, I'm kind of going through, all right, Joseph, what would you do here? What would your son Artie do? What would you want? What's the direction? Are we doing the right things? You know, and it's inspirational to be among all of those timepieces and those historical things, and the voices kind of, they speak to you, right? I think the answers are always right in front of us. You know, but it's sometimes you get caught up, like you were saying, in the selling of the timepieces as opposed to the why were they created. You know, Accutron, I mentioned it before, and I'll finish the thought, is that they were saying, like, how do you redo that? Well, the one thing that I reminded them in that meeting was the first watch was called Accutron because of its accuracy through electronics. And then the reason it was built was not to become a watch on a wrist. It was to get us to the moon. It was to solve a real problem. Like, if you want something that's going to change the world and be significant, it has to speak to people at their core, you know? So when they, you know, did this watch, they created a renewable energy resource on your wrist. And renewable energy is a big thing right now, right? Like, how do you create that? How is it sustainable? How can it move the world? How can it help? And that's where the company went. And that's, again, respect that I have for Citizen, is those engineers, along with, you know, coupling with the US and teams like myself and other people, you know, they're listening. The answers are there and they're whispering, you know, through history. But you got to talk to people like you, right? And people like me to really hear it. Because if you're just sitting in a boardroom, you're collecting the same ideas over and over again. That doesn't help anybody.
So maybe on that theme, is there do you think there's a sort of untapped pot of gold in your collection that you would like to see Bulova reflect in modern watches? And then the converse of that, or the inverse of that question is there a bit of your collection that you think should stay within the past and sort of and never be reissued or influence a modern watch?
Yeah, I like those questions. So again, I'm very lucky, very blessed to be a collector and then be able to work with the company. So I have been lucky enough to have a voice, so to speak, or a seat at the table, and be able to kind of just, you know, they ask the questions, what do you think? And it's nice to be able to kind of put my 2 cents in, right? It's free advice, so we all know what it's worth, but, you know, it's nice to be able to kind of, to be able to add to that conversation and help shape where some designs go. So I think the Rubaiyat was really special. And I always thought that they should do it in a more, they did this beautiful modernization of it, and it won, you know, awards and all kinds of things for its design and marketing. But I love the originals. And I always wanted to see original pocket watches, original, like carved, you know, beautiful dials. And I wanted to see that remade. And the funny thing is, we may see that happen sooner rather than later. But when I first asked a while back, they said, Richard, we have this one pocket watch that I think is historically significant. It's made with 5 different types of gold, right? It has white gold, 18 karat gold, green gold, 14 karat gold, and rose gold. And it's a cornucopia. And it's hand carved, cornucopia, relief carved, and it's covered and coated in all this gold. And they said, Richard, if we tried to make a solid gold dial out of those 5 elements, and it was hand done, and it's like the dial was like an outrage, tens of thousands of dollars, right? They were like, it's not who we are anymore, right? Like, we can't be that. That's what we were. That's where all watches were. And if I charged $100 for a watch in 1910, That's an expensive watch, right? That's a watch most people can never obtain. So I think that we have to be careful about recreating some of the past. But I think we should for sure bring some of that stuff back and honestly even take risks. They did the American Girl watch and they made it in a very small quantity and it sold out almost immediately. So all of the people who buy from a retail perspective couldn't even buy the watch because it sold out so quickly. I had one woman at the time that was in a store local that bought like 7 before she even saw it. She's like, just put me down for 7. Because they knew historically it was going to be, and it was tiny. When it came out, it would fit on a child's arm, right? Or a small woman's wrist. And people were shocked on the size, but it still was wildly popular. So I think there's something to be said for that. Should there be watches we never make again? Yeah. I mean, we have for sure watches that you should never make some films a sequel, right? It's the same idea. Like you hit the jackpot. It is there's watches we have that are in the Air and Space Museum, that are in all of these places that I mean just will tell our history forever. I don't think we need to make that watch again. You know, like so that's when it's that big of a deal, leave it alone.
Well,
That's a great answer. Thanks.
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we've got a few minutes left, and as we always keep these things to time. So if anyone has a final question, they can ask it, or I've got a final one if no one else does. Anyone? No? I couldn't help but ask. So I want to hear the most satisfactory addition to your collection. So for whatever reason, whether it was something that took a long time to find, whether it was something that was surprising, whether it was something that actually, when it arrived, was just much more incredible than you'd expected. What's maybe the most amazing, satisfying addition over the years?
So I don't think any of us could probably pin down one. I think that when I found all of the automatics from the early 1930s, when I had that whole collection together, and went to the National Watch and Clock Museum here in the US and found all of the research and the patents for them. That was like one of the most pivotal for me. I was like, I have to do this. I have to protect this history. No one else is going to do this, right? So that was a defining moment in my collecting. But being able to get an A15, which there was very few made of. I've never acquired a diver. I would love to still be able to find one of those and buy one of those. But the A15 was really a special timepiece for me. It took a really long time for me to find one that was all original, including the strap, which is like non-existent. And to be honest, it's not even something I've ever let be, like to Ed's point, I don't even let people photograph that. Like I don't let them see it. That's mine. I have a watch that I will be buried in, and I have 4 of them. They are, and for collectors, Steve, you'll really know this one, is the corner cut or the cut corner Charles Lindbergh watch, right? That's the very first version of that watch, and it came out in like 25-ish. But there was never a gold one. But I have 4 all gold pieces. So they were made. They weren't advertised. Were they watches that were, made but never done? Because I mean, you go into the offices on any given day and go over to the design team and merchandising team, and I can show you 100 watches that they're never going to make, but they designed them. And there's a different version that came out, right? Like, so is it one of those? Like nobody knows, right? But those watches, I love them, right? So there's one in the museum and they don't show it. And I have 3. So to be honest, this is the first time I've really even talked about it publicly, that those exist. So if the world, as you're watching this, sees that and you have more, 1, I'll buy them. 2, really take good care of them because they're special.
Great. Well, that sounds like it sounds like you retain many astonishing timepieces in your collection, and
Yeah, not as many as I would like. I mean, I'd like to keep them all, but you got to eventually, trade them out. So I think we're down about 400 pocket watches, and then the rest are wrist watches. I do have a lot of really nice. I actually just found when I'm trying to prove it, but I don't have the proof yet. But I think we're gonna find it. I think I have one of the very first desk clocks that were ever built. That was the first thing that they ever made. That was a Bulova clock. I think I have. Took a while to find that, so we're working on trying to prove that. But I have a few pieces that matter, but I wish I still had them all.
well, I hope that anytime I'm next on the West Coast, East Coast, you're on the East Coast of the States, I'll shoot you a message to see if there's any way we can meet up and share
Get
some of
together,
our respective
watches, build something,
and
get
thank
on
you.
the lathe, get on the all the equipment to have some fun on some timepieces.
So thank you very much for your time today. I know it's the middle of your workday still, but it's been very generous of you. And yeah, I think thanks on behalf of us all for a wonderful evening. And take care, and we'll be in touch again in future.
Yeah, Hamish, let's definitely get in touch, and let me thank everybody who's here for spending the time with us. Like it's really, this matters most in my opinion, and that's why I'm part of the brand. So I hope this is one of many that we're able to do together. And I would love to be able to meet everybody in person one day over on your side of the world.
Sure. Well, absolutely. If you're ever coming this way, let us know, and we'll definitely organize something to have a great evening together. So
outstanding. Thank you all very much for your time and
I'll
your
finish
commitment.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks so much. That was great. Cheers.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.